Next, we'll have our state superintendent's report. Superintendent Dixon, are you ready?
I am ready. I think we're, Jeff, if you'll bring up the slide deck. And for those new board members listening in, for when I used to first hear the superintendent's report and it was on the USDB schedule, I had to really pay attention to wonder if that was Superintendent Colvin or my remarks. So you'll get used to that, that you have two superintendents whom you supervise. And I really love and appreciate Superintendent Colvin. He's done a great job. So I want to start off with just sharing one of the many events that's changed due to COVID. Of course, most of us are not in the office, and yesterday would have been our traditional holiday breakfast where we serve a hot meal to all of our employees, and the meal is nice and the activities are nice and the ambiance is nice. But what I really miss is being able to see every one of our employees come through and greet them personally. And it's one of my favorite days, if not my favorite day of the year. So we held a virtual event and it was great. So proud of our Employee Action Committee. And we did get to see a lot of our employees. So today I thought I would spend time, we have three of us sharing this report time with you. And I thought I would make sure our focus is on data. Board members Hanson and Lear and I had a really good conversation a couple of weeks ago, and they've made some requests that I think are pertinent to all of you about what do we know and what kind of data are we collecting. So we're going to go micro to macro and talk about what data we have and focus on health and safety, some academic data sources, and then a survey that we're putting out through the tool of Qualtrics, and what we'll be gathering and for what purpose, and then hopefully have a little bit of time for discussion for things that you might want to see on that survey. So I'll start out by just talking about a couple of things related to health and safety. You may have had some of your constituency contact you about testing, or you've heard about it, and there was an article in the Deseret News about Davis's efforts with testing of their students. So we've been able to access these Bionx rapid tests, and these are the tests that can be turned around in 15 to 20 minutes. And while our educators and students have been able to go to Test Utah sites and other places with the tests that take a little longer, the antigen tests, they, sometimes it can be really cumbersome and it takes a while to get the data back, et cetera. So these Bionx tests have been a game changer for us. And the purpose of the testing with our students, first and foremost, is really to decrease the transmission. When you can figure out who is infected, you can do a better job of isolating. And so the ability then to enable our school and staff members to continue to participate in in-person learning where possible, and to have them participate in extracurricular activities are also purposes of the testing. And then it can really help reduce the risk by identifying where those positive individuals are, and really quickly isolate them without them being in school for several days before they're isolated. And then we're also seeing that it incentivizes risk reduction behavior. We see, so our students are pretty good about wearing masks anyway, but it's also helping as they walk out of the doors or they're in the hallways to keep their masks on and distance where possible outside of the school. So students want to play and they want to be in school. And so all of these things together are really help mitigating the virus. So I want to talk a little bit about just the progress and proposals. We have been focused on high school testing. This came from the HERO project, and the HERO project that many of you may have heard about has been conducted with a grant at the University of Utah, and they have been testing high school students, elementary and middle school students along the Wasatch Front, and they've used the comparison of, excuse me, I'm sorry, they've used the comparison data of in-person learning in Salt Lake District with surrounding districts, and really trying to see how in-person versus remote learning can prevent the spread. And what we found is that it seemed to be about the same at the elementary and middle school level, but high school, of course, is a little bit of a variance, and that's where we're seeing the spread anyway. And you've seen that bracketed age group of 14 or 15 to 25-year-olds. And that age group is traced along with other age groups as part of the COVID Utah website and platform where all of that is tracked. And so given that high school students tend to be more spreaders and carriers, we started with this testing during the football playoffs. The kids got to the end of the season. We were ready to conduct playoffs, and the transmission rate really accelerated. So testing was conducted for that a 2-week period, kind of the end of October, beginning of November. And we learned a lot from that experience, and we could see exactly who tested positive and didn't, and we were able to have teams play through that. It also included quarantine, but students were still able to play. So then a health order came from the governor's office, from the Department of Health, the week of November 30th. And this order said that winter sports could continue, extracurricular activities rather, if there was a testing protocol in place. I'll talk about that in a minute. There was also a pilot at Granger High School that broadened beyond just the athletes. And this was conducted the week prior to the public health order. And it went fairly smoothly, and we learned a lot from that pilot. So we'll be starting test to stay pilots through from next week through the end. And when I say we, it's really the Department of Health running this, but we are a support system to them. And this will occur through the end of December. And then we're planning for continued increased testing in high schools. And Sarah Young on our staff is going to speak in a minute, not so much about testing, but she has carried a heavy load. And I'm so grateful that Robert Gerke pointed her out as one of our heroes of getting things like wipes and PPE and the Bionx tests out to schools. They were warehoused at the Department of Health, but that takes a lot to navigate that. So she and Sarah Harward have been really helpful to our schools in getting the materials that they need. So just quickly, you'll hear these two terms, test to stay and test to play. And I won't go into details other than to say test to stay is a protocol that's being considered for when a school reaches a case threshold where they have to remove to remote learning. And so students could choose to be tested and stay in school. And if they didn't want to be tested, then they would be out the full quarantine period. So there's some incentive to get tested in order to just we're trying to stop that revolving door of in and out and in and out. It's really hard on families. It's hard on our teachers and our students. So trying to mitigate going in and out of remote. And then test to play is, as I mentioned, it's used to allow staff members and students to participate in extracurricular activities. I will say before we move to a different kind of assessment that we want to talk about, that it's my understanding probably right now, the governor is standing in front of the press to talk about the way forward in his weekly updates. And I believe that they are discussing a new quarantine protocol based on the CDC recommendations and guidelines that just came out. So the protocols for testing will be updated and finalized. It's my understanding after the governor speaks today. And so I will make sure that the board has those hot off the press so that you can really see what the protocols are. And then I'm happy to follow up with you with more information. I want to transition now into a different kind of assessment, and just wondering, I'm sure you as board members are wondering, I certainly do every day, how are our students doing during this challenging time, and how do we know, and what data sources can we use, and what will we be able to use now and at the end of the year? So Darren's going to dive into that a little for us.
Thank you, Superintendent. I appreciate having a few minutes with the board today to give you an update on that issue of how and when will we know more information about the impacts of soft closures, quarantines, remote learning, all of the different conditions that our students are experiencing and have been experiencing since, as Adam and Chad with Ogden School District did a great job of refreshing our minds about the timeline of when our world changed, both in our individual lives, our communities, families, and certainly within our schools. We have, now that we're 9 months into this, what some people call, and I think it's true, an experiment, this worldwide experiment in education of disrupting what would be considered normal and really opening up opportunities for innovation. What are we learning from that? And I want to spend just a few moments talking about that. First off, it's important for you to understand that your staff has developed and organized a collaborative team of individuals and expertise. It was mentioned, one of the board members mentioned how Ogden School District has demonstrated expertise and talent within their organization, and that's certainly true. And essentially all of our districts have skill sets that bring expertise and add value to group work. And we've taken the approach at the state board of enlisting the help of LEA partners who are interested in joining our team. And so we formulated this team to develop our research questions and conduct analysis on our state summative assessments. And at the end of my presentation, I'll review with the board the variety of assessments that are administered under the direction of the State Board of Education across the state of Utah. Of course, it's always important to recognize that there are, one thing we have learned over the last 9 months is things can change quickly and rapidly. So the path that we're on today, we just have to acknowledge that there can be changes to that bring about changes to our plans and our needs. We also, the last time the board met, there were some recommendations from the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee, which originated back in the fall, and those came to the board. Two specific recommendations that the board authorized staff to take last month, but also a reference or a nod to this opportunity to learn, or OTL data, and a need to gather some of that information to contextualize the assessment data that we're going to get. And attached to the agenda item for the superintendent's report is a draft of those questions, which we intend to, we've been working with both our Pearson high school assessment vendor and also our grade 3 through 8 RISE vendor to incorporate these opportunity to learn questions into their assessment platform, which will add great value to our ability to understand what the impact of this experiment that our students and educators have been forced into, how to interpret that information that we collect. I just want to note that early on, last April or in May, in the example that I've given here, the Brookings Institute and other groups started to forecast or predict what would be the effect of COVID-19, especially with the closures of schools, the sudden closures of schools in the spring of 2020. Those predictions range depending on the reports and studies that you look at. I've thrown this one up here because it seemed to be the most dramatic predictions, but it's important for us to note that we don't know what the impact has been. We are starting to get, if you'll go to the next slide, please. We are starting to get some reports out from different entities, and the NWEA has released a report just a few weeks ago titled How Kids Are Performing, Tracking the Impact of COVID-19 on Reading and Mathematics. That report has garnered some national media attention. It's using local assessments. As our board knows, districts have the autonomy and authority to purchase off-the-shelf assessments and use those to meet local needs that they might have within their district and schools. And this study utilizes data from the STAR assessment system that is out there. We also have preliminary results from our state assessment system, and I'll talk about those a little more detailed in a moment. Our KEEP entry, our kindergarten entry exit profile, and then our Acadience. Some of you might recognize it better as DIBELS. It's our reading screener, and we administer that test 3 times a year. And so we've received the results of both of those tests on a statewide basis and are in the process of beginning to analyze the data. I'll show you some raw data related to that here momentarily. And then, you know, our teachers and leaders, the anecdotal information that we receive as our kids go into our school settings, and some of them go in and out of quarantine because of possible exposure. Their teachers go in and out, on occasion, go in and out of quarantine because of possible exposure or because of COVID, contracting COVID themselves. We have school systems that go in and out of in-person learning. And then we still have Salt Lake City School District that is completely online. And so we know there are really important challenges that they're facing, and there's a lot of pressure that's being felt across the educational system that impact the outcomes of our students. If you go to the next slide, we'll review just a high-level review of our KEEP data. We know from the October 1 data that our kindergarten enrollment statewide has declined. We still had 43,725 students participate in the KEEP entry assessment, which is 93.2% participation rate. That was surprising to me that we were able to get that many students participating in that statewide assessment. That constitutes only about a 3% drop in the percent of students in kindergarten who participate in that assessment typically. You'll see here, again, please note too that the kindergarten entry assessment is not measuring instructional programs because most of these students are coming directly from their homes, but it does give us an insight into disruptions that could have occurred or the effects of these disruptions on normal learning activities within the homes of our families across the state of Utah. But you'll see here there's no significant evidence of impact on our kindergarten entry data. If you please go to the next slide. This is, again, raw data. So it's important, again, I'll say this over and over again, this is raw data. We haven't applied all the business rules to the data that we've collected to this point. And we will, as that is completed, we certainly will share that information, not just with the board, but with the public and our LEAs, especially those who don't have data analysts built into their systems, and they rely on State Board of Education staff to help them understand their data. I've circled in the middle there the first grade. This is the most pronounced declines that we have. The red bars indicate students who are reading well below benchmark or performed at a well below benchmark level when they took this reading screener. The yellow is below. So the red and yellow combined represent students, so the percent of students who are measured on that assessment, the beginning of your reading assessment, to be well below or below benchmark. First grade is where we see the most pronounced drop. It's 13% decrease in the number of students who are at or above reading level in the first grade. So again, the other thing to remember here is this is measuring information that is directly related to the spring immediate closure of schools, the immediate transition of, and enclosure is a misstatement, the soft closure, immediate transition from in-person, face-to-face learning, small group instruction for many students, individual supports for many students into a virtual setting as these tests are administered at the very beginning of each school year. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. So we still are in a position of not fully understanding the impacts of COVID, especially on the instructional outcomes for the 2021 school year. These are some things that we might expect to see based on the analysis that's been conducted outside of the state of Utah, including there are other countries that have completed their, in the southern hemisphere of our world, who've completed their instructional cycle for the calendar year, for their school year, and have been able to measure the impacts of the entire COVID disruptions in their instructional year that they've just completed. So based on that, we should expect to see some declines in achievement and reduced growth. We expect to see differential impact on student groups. It's likely that students will experience declines in achievement in other areas that we don't necessarily measure, and then it's likely that students will need additional support to catch up to the pre-disruption expectations that we have. I want to just review with the board the timeline of the assessments and the timeline that are set out for the school year to give you an understanding of when to expect your staff to be able to come back with results and analysis on those results. I apologize for all the acronyms that are up there. If we write these out, it just fills the whole screen in. I've mentioned the KEEP, the cadence. The PEEP is the preschool entry exit profile. Not all students in the state participate in that test. Also note the asterisk. The asterisk that's attached to some of these indicates that those are assessments that are available to be proctored in a remote setting. So it might, when I mentioned the high return rate on or participation rate for the KEEP entry, There's a couple of factors that really weigh into that. Number one is it was available for remote proctoring. And number two, it also indicates how connected that assessment is to the instructional services that teachers, in this case, kindergarten teachers, are providing to the students. So it's a highly valued assessment across the state. And typically we get a high % of participation in that. Our RISE mid-year window, those are relatively a small number of students, typically students who are in advanced math in the middle school level. Most of those students will take their RISE test, associated RISE test, at the end of their course, which for some students, again, in our state will be the end of their first semester of those courses. We also, I think is important to note, we administer the Apple test. That's for our DLI students. It stands for Assessment of Performance Toward Proficiency in Languages. All of our students who are in dual language immersion programs across the state of Utah participate in those tests. We don't typically collect that data at the state level. It's available for district use to share with parents about the quality of their dual language immersion programs and the status of their individual students in acquiring their target language. Those assessments are underway right now and being administered across the state of Utah. And we'll still, whereas we typically don't collect that data at the state level, it will give us, again, an early insight into the impacts of these disruptions and changes to the instructional programs of our students. Access stands, that's the test that we administer to students who are learning English. Last year, Utah was one of a very few number of states were able to complete all of those assessments to our English language learners before the March 19th date that was highlighted on Adam and Chad's slides. If you'll go to the next slide, please. All right, and this brings us to throughout the spring and into the end of the year. The Utah Spire Plus, again, is our 9th and 10th grade assessment. It's designed to be an end of year assessment. It's not course-based. We have the ACT scheduled to be delivered in March and April. Last year, this March 19th soft closure period interrupted the administration of the ACT to many of our 11th grade students. And we worked with the vendor and provided vouchers, and a large number of students who were unable to complete the test in their school setting were able to complete the ACT in June, July, August, September, October, November, and even some of them are scheduled for December with the voucher that was provided to them. And then we'll finish up the year in June with our end of year assessments for both the PEEP, the KEEP, and Arcadians. And again, we're hopeful that we'll be able to collect a significant number or significant amount of data related to student achievement, measuring various elements of student learning. Obviously, not everything that students learn in schools can be measured, but these are data elements that we'll receive and be able to overlay with the opportunity to learn data that we'll be collecting this year, and hopefully be able to report back to the board in the summer. Typically, both of our large vendors, Pearson and Cambion, provide us our data file in July. It takes a few weeks to go through and apply all the business rules to that, and then some additional weeks to conduct the analysis. So it will likely be August or the middle part of September when we'll be able to completely report out on the impacts that we're able to measure through the state assessments that we're administering under the direction of you, the State Board of Education. That concludes my portion of the presentation. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, I think Sarah is up.
Yeah, I think we've got just a few minutes left, so we'll speed through with Sarah, but just thank you so much, Darren. And one of the additional points of reflection was, all right, so we have some preliminary assessment data. What will we be gathering? And then what will we be required to report to the federal government, to the legislature? And what other things should the board know in terms of being able to leverage policy, mitigate issues, et cetera? So yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, sorry, we've got a couple of hands popped up here.
Okay.
So before we move on, Board Member Davis, and then Board Member Lear. Board Member Davis.
Thank you. Thank you to Darren for that great update. You and I had words with a representative who was really curious as to how we were at a state level going to figure out impacts of learning modes and things. So I appreciate that. And then Superintendent Dixon, my question was actually to your presentation. And it was just a question. You had mentioned that there were higher transmission rates in secondary schools that were face-to-face instruction than in secondary schools that were online, but that elementary schools and junior high schools were relatively the same with transition rates depending on face-to-face or online instruction. If I missed this, I apologize, but could you tell us to what degree the difference was in the transition rates in the secondary level between face-to-face and online?
Yeah, I don't have that data in front of me. I can get that for you. It was something like 1% versus 1.8%. But I don't quote me on that, but I'll send that to you. There is a slide deck from the HERO project that I can send out to the board, so you'll have all of that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Board Member Lear.
My question is to Darren's presentation, and I have been trying to figure this out, and I think you sort of did what sometimes lawyers do, buried me, not intentionally, but you buried me with data, and I couldn't see the big picture, Darren. So I have a very simple question, and that is, give me your professional opinion of how valid our evaluation of student process or progress, I'm sorry. How valid can that possibly be given the tests that were broken up last spring and it sounds like submitted, if they were at all, piecemeal, and then the way we may have to give them, and I'm using the we as the state, we will have to give them this spring. Is this data, are these data even meaningful?
Yeah,
in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question, Board Member Lear, and I think that across our communities, many people have those same wonderings. And I'm gonna divide it up. I'll focus in on the RISE assessment. That's the most high profile. It affects the most students grades 3 through 8. And to try to answer that, it won't be a lawyer answer, hopefully, but
yeah, hopefully.
we have to we have some things in our disposal, some arrows in our quiver that are assets. We've been using the same and measuring the same standards in language arts and math since 2014. So we have this historical data set that gives us great value for comparative purposes, especially when we start talking about scale scores that students get and what we expect to see and what we've seen historically over a long period of years compared to most states who have disrupted either their standards or their assessment systems in a way that interrupts their ability to have longitudinal data. So the RISE assessment in particular, grades 3 through 8, math and language arts, will have more value than if we look at Utah Spire Plus, which is a relatively new assessment. We were able to administer it one time before we went into the 2020 spring, but we still have a data set for comparative purposes that allows us to conduct some analysis on. When I showed the kindergarten entry, we have 4 years worth of data. That again, the value starts to come into play when we can look at comparisons to previous years for students, for schools, for student groups, and what we would expect to see under normal circumstances. So in that regard, the data does have value. You've also heard me speak previously and up to the legislature in their interim committee meeting last month, that we do have concerns about using this data for school accountability, that we think it's unwise to use it for accountability, so it's a little confusing. I can understand to some people where we'd say that, and then we're also saying the data will be valuable for us to help us understand the impacts of these changes in modalities for our students' learning, changes in services they've received, especially when we layer over the top of the data this opportunity to learn or qualitative information that helps us better understand what our students experience through this school year in particularly, 2021 school year.
Thank you. I may contact you and maybe ask some more specific questions, but thanks very much for that more general statement and comment.
Okay, Board Member Earl, hand is raised.
Yes, I'll try to be quick. I know we're ready to move on. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Down so you can see me. I just had a couple of, well, maybe a couple of comments and then a question as well. I went up to the top of Cache County School District and visited 7 schools about 2 weeks ago. And over, I kept hearing from both the educators and those that the staff that work there that they were so appreciative that they were able to remain in school and the great things that they are doing there right now. I just had a question. It just seems to me that, do we know the data or the numbers of transmission outside of school? It would seem like the data would be available. I know you're saying it's 1% versus 1.8 possibly, Superintendent, but the transmission that's taking place is primarily, especially in our high schoolers, if I remember correctly, would be in outside school environments, meaning either at home or engaging with friends or other type of situations. And with just that, asking that question, if that's the case, are we having a growing concern over not having kids in school and having them on online learning? Anyways, I'm just curious if there's any information there. And then the other one is the test that you talked about, the quick test. Do we know what the false positive rates on those are? I know those tests that are done in 15 minutes, it doesn't have as great an accuracy. So thank you.
We are asking great questions, and somebody from the health department should be here to answer those, not me. But I will say, I will say that the results that we get in regards to the testing of students, that's not necessarily indicating where they got it, if they got it at school or they got it in the ecosystem outside of school. So you ask a really great question. And a lot of people say, how do we know where they got it? A lot of that's done through contact tracing. But it doesn't matter whether they're getting it outside of school or where they're getting it. That's if a student is considered positive, that is in the count. And those counts are posted on the COVID website of the covid.utah.gov. So you can see those case counts as reported up to the Department of Health from the testing centers, from the schools, from the the local departments of health. Also, we're engaging in a new software, and by we, I mean the school system of RedCap, and it's reporting that will happen at the school sites and be fed into the system as well. So can we pull that apart and say, where did you get that, and count those differently? That's a little bit harder to do. So the count is just the count that we get of students who have been tested or who have tested positive, and versus how many have been tested, just like the count that you see reported in the news every day.
It just seems like it might be a little bit relevant when we're closing schools that kids are having to go to grandparents or other places where they may be either spreading or
Right.
Anyway, so, and you're right, once a child's sick or shows symptoms, we don't want them in school. So that is an accurate statement. So thank you.
So Superintendent, I thought you were going to get to your end of your presentation before.
We are.
Questions, but Darren said, are there any questions? So the hand.
No, it's all right, sir.
I still have one hand raised, and that's Board Member Hanson. So we better take that.
I'll be happy to defer to the end, Chair. No
Okay,
problem.
thank you. All right, please continue, Dr. Dixon.
All right, so we'll turn it to Sarah so she can go quickly through the process forward with conducting a survey and what we are trying to capture through that survey purpose, and then hopefully have time for you all to tell us what we're missing. So, Sarah.
Thank you, Superintendent and Chair Huntsman. Sarah Young, Director of Strategic Initiatives. So currently, staff has been in the process of working on a CARES survey in collaboration with other state entities, including the governor's office and our partners at the Legislative Fiscal Office as well. The CARES survey is based on a couple of elements. The first one I'll highlight is the federal reporting requirements related to both the ESSER and GEAR funding that was received through the U.S. Department of Education. This is 69 questions that we are asking our local leaders to respond to allow us to complete the federal reporting requirements that are due to the U.S. Department of Education in February of this upcoming year. Those questions are very specifically selected in looking at the existing requirements, and we've broken it down in terms of the data sets we already have available to us at USBE and the data sets that we need from the local level. So we've really scaled it down to try and be thoughtful about the information and the reporting burden that's placed on our locals, as we know that their capacity is stressed. The majority of these questions really focus on financial and implementation data. And again, were designed by the US Department of Education in compliance with our funding as received. The second component that exists within this survey are the Utah legislative requests and reporting for CARES. So recognizing back in September that we were going to need to do this outreach for reporting, we partnered with the Legislative Fiscal Analyst's Office to provide that question and data set to our legislative leaders and to say what else is there that you would like to know about to help inform the decisions you're making in regards to next steps for both fiscal resources and policy in general. That is an additional 20 questions, and we've provided backup to this item that highlights those reporting guidelines in more detail. Additionally, recognizing that there was interest from our State Board of Education members to do some additional questioning, we thought it made the most sense to really build that into this singular survey so that our local education leaders were responding to one survey comprehensively with all of these items, as opposed to separate inquiries occurring over a longer period of time. Again, the focus really being just on reducing that burden at the local level. As far as the logistics of the existing survey, we are utilizing the Qualtrics platform to streamline agency, federal, and state reporting requirements. It just presents the data in a way that makes it easier for staff at the agency to transfer and translate into the appropriate reporting formats for both the federal and the state moving forward. The current plan is to release this tool tomorrow, Friday, December the 4th, and that email will be sent to our Title I directors, business administrators, and grant points of contact associated with ESSER and GEAR. We've asked our LEAs to respond by January 8th, 2021, giving USBE an opportunity to compile that data, do any follow-ups as necessary for individuals who may not have submitted, and be able to prepare our required reports for both legislative session as well as the U.S. Department of Education. In regards to additional questions that the board has provided through leadership that we may consider in regards to adding into the current survey tool, we've highlighted these specific points that may be of interest. And for each of these, I do have sample questions that I will quickly highlight that staff have drafted to try and address these individual efforts and topic areas. So moving in regards to that, the first one is the instructional service model assurance. And so recognizing that our LEAs did apply for waivers earlier in the school year in regards to their instructional model and the requirements of R277419, we are including this as an additional assurance at each LEA to provide validation of what specific instructional model they are using, and then have a follow-up question in regards to the percentage of students who've been using only remote learning since the beginning of the school year, just to help us gauge at a state where that percentage is statewide, recognizing we have many LEAs that are offering online only options that parents may have chosen. In addition to that, based on some of the feedback that we're receiving anecdotally, we are looking to include potentially 2 questions on teacher employment indicators. We've tried to make these as straightforward as possible, seeking information about teacher retirements that may have happened previous to the school year, as well as teacher resignation as compared to previous school years, as kind of a bellwether indicator of some of our system needs moving forward. Additionally, we have drafted a question around LEA partnerships with the local health department, recognizing those are so vital to our responses in a pandemic. This would be a matrices style question looking at a Likert scale of coordination across the sub-bullets you see here, such as the role of the and partnership of the local health department in regards to the LEA school reopening plan, the implementation of that, and containing of specific outbreaks. We also have another suggested question in regards to LEA intervention strategies, just looking at really highlighting for the board as well as staff intervention strategies that an LEA has implemented. And we would break this down in terms of asking for responses specific to elementary and then a secondary response in regards to secondary. Last but not least, in regards to just trying to gather as much information from the field as possible and looking to really scale those items of success, we have 2 open-ended questions that we've drafted for your consideration. What best practices have been developed in response to COVID-19 for the schools? And then additionally, what successful strategies have you developed that you will continue to implement beyond COVID-19? When Superintendent Dixon and the board really set forth that vision of reimagining education, we want to make sure that those pockets of innovation have the opportunity to not just be highlighted, but also then to be shared to the broader community. So I would then turn it back over to Superintendent Dixon and Board Chair Huntsman. Thank you for the opportunity to present the existing survey and additional questions that the board may want to consider.
I would just thank you so much, Sarah. I would just add a postscript that some of these data the questions on the survey, we will have backup data. For example, the questions about teachers. Kristen Campbell in Teaching and Learning, I know, is running reports right now looking at teacher attrition and mobility. So some of that we can gather from other reports, but it's always nice to have some qualitative data to triangulate that with as well. So at this point, Chair Huntsman, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, we have several hands up. One of the questions or challenges that I have with the survey is, I have a terrible appetite to be a data monger, and I want data but I'm not sure within the survey or as you formulate this data, if you have the little disclaimers that you see in other places that say, well, this came this, and this was the date and how old it is, because a lot of times we get confused with, well, this must be real time now. And in the space of COVID, that constantly changing from week to week. And so I'm curious, Superintendent, and we do have other hands up, but how am I going to know once this is put in place and or the public to say, well, does it have a timestamp on it or any other kind of disclaimer? Has your staff thought of that? Because this is a big undertaking.
Yeah, one of the benefits, a great question. One of the benefits of Qualtrics is that we can date stamp things, and then we have the data so that we don't have to go back and keep sending out other surveys. We can house the data to see what information we already have, and then again, triangulate that with other sources. So that date stamp, and that's always in the heading of the survey that goes out, and Sarah will take care of that. Sarah, I don't know if you want to add anything, but we generally state the purpose, the time, what it's being used for. And these are due back, as she mentioned, the beginning of January. So our goal is to report to you back in the January, report back to you in the January meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Sarah Young, did you have something to add?
Sorry, I would provide one follow-up. Just because of when the date falls, we would most likely be reporting in the February board meeting in regards to these specific outcomes, because they actually have until the 8th of January to respond, which is after the January board meeting.
Sorry about that, Sarah. I had the 5th in my head.
Okay, well, it's about managing expectations, and this will be good to get. Board Member Hanson.
Thank you. And first, a big thank you to the superintendent and staff for getting this ball rolling. I've felt a real need for us to, as a board, to understand what's going on with the folks who have boots on the ground and who are dealing with the everyday challenges that this virus has presented to us over the past months. I have a couple of questions, suggestions that I'd certainly like to hear feedback on, and always being mindful of not trying to overburden our LEAs, but trying to tease out as much data that's valuable to us as we can from this. I know that's a balance, but looking first at the instructional service model questions, I would like somehow to understand the number of student online days versus the number of student in-person days that we have at the schools. And I believe that data should be available somewhere within the schools. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can get that out of our questions. And then moving on to the teacher employment indicators section. We're asking a couple of yes, no's, and I understand we want this to be easy, but in order to answer those yes, no's, I think that the superintendent or whoever's answering this is going to have some data. And I'm wondering if we can request, instead of the yes, no, that data. For example, how many teachers retired last year and how many teachers retired this year, so that we could see that and see if it's a difference of 1 or a difference of 10 or 15 or 20%. Also on the other question.
And sir, can I just insert the answer to that? That's the data that actually can come out of Cactus. So that's something that would likely be burdensome to survey, because we're trying to stick to, given all the questions that we have, we can get more accurate dating out of our Cactus model. And that's what Kristen's doing right now.
Great, Superintendent, if that will come out of Cactus, I understand and would accept that. But to answer this question, our superintendent needs to have that data in hand. And so I don't think it's burdensome for them. They're going to answer yes. They must know somehow that more teachers have retired this year compared to last year. So they must be looking at that. So that's my only point here. I don't think it's burdensome to ask for the numbers they need to answer these questions. And then on on this employment indicators, I'd also like to know if there have been any furloughs or layoffs of staff, not necessarily teachers, but support staff, and how our LEAs have dealt with that. Then when we talk about the local health department, if we could just ask who is the person in the LEA who's been assigned to work with the local health department, who's been doing that, so that we can understand at what level that interaction has been taking place. Those are hopefully not too burdensome, but those would be my request as we put the survey out, to maybe do a little bit of fine tuning and try to get that information. But again, this work is much appreciated, and I'm certainly happy to see this moving forward. Thank you.
Superintendent, before I call on the next one, I'm kind of concerned on Board Member Hanson's question on furloughs and layoffs, and that we're never in that contracting space. And I know the LEAs that I represent are going to say, why are you there? And why is that relevant? Because a lot of the LEAs out there do layoffs, and well, they hire and they let people go based on the number of students they have, how much revenue they have. And I'm like, for board policy, I'm not sure what that data, how that data might help us, because their layoffs happen. From my experience and working with them, is based on revenue and or do they have a need for that particular service. But is this in the space of COVID related, or they put this on COVID, or is it funding? I'm not sure, Board Member Hanson. It's a great question. Yeah,
I'm not interested in digging into the general details of their how they employ their staff. I'm interested in COVID related. I want to see the impact of COVID and if that's caused layoffs or furloughs amongst non-teacher staff.
because that challenge will be because of linked to usually to funding, and I'm just putting myself in their shoes, so I'm not sure how that question would be crafted. But
COVID related furloughs or layoffs of non-teacher staff, that would be what I would request, just to see the impact on the school community.
all right, okay. Board Member Cannon.
Thank you. As I've listened to this presentation, sort of an overarching concern keeps coming back to my mind. And that concern was brought to us in a public comment in our November meeting by Sarah Jones, who said that educators want to know who has the ultimate authority to respond to a COVID-19 outbreak. And I believe that as this came upon us and we were scrambling to try to figure out what to do, that there's been some muddy water there. But we have local LEAs who are interpreting the guidelines that we put together. Was it our intent that local boards be able to override the health department recommendations? Because I think that's happened in some cases. And I believe that as we go through this, surely the final output should be having some clear guidelines from the governor and the health department, if indeed the health department is the ultimate authority for what happens, in terms of a pandemic outbreak, or do we rely on local boards? Do they have the power to say they'll agree to the number 15 as being able to close schools? I've heard from a lot of people about the 15 cases of COVID, how it might be relevant in elementaries or junior highs, but it keeps immediately closing high schools. There should be better numbers in place. And I believe as we're going through this, we should gain that information and know how to put better numbers in place. And if we have to call upon the health department to do that, we should do that. Or maybe as a state, that's something we should do so that we can give appropriate guidelines to the locals. But that's just been a real concern and a constant irritation to me as I see the state and all the districts going through and the kids going through what COVID has brought to them. So I would really like to have carefully drawn lines of authority and maybe better numbers, guidelines, either from the health department or from the state to give direction to what happens in this kind of a situation that we're in now.
Okay. Board Member Lear.
This is for Sarah Young, if that's okay. I have what I hope is a simple question, Sarah. You talk about gathering all of these data from various LEAs, but I wasn't sure in that explanation if you were saying that every LEA will be required to report individually so that there'll be follow-up and requirements from every LEA for information, and then that information will both be summarized, but it will also be available per LEA so that we have that kind of, both the board has, the legislature has, perhaps the feds have individualized responses? Or were you saying that we'll ask LEAs and however many of them, somewhere between 41 and 170, however many of them respond, we'll summarize all that information, and our requirement to the feds on those acronym programs is just a summarized report from the state, or will all LEAs? I just feel like if we're going to burden LEAs, they ought to be burdened equally. And I just want to hear what your plan is for a single report on those that comes from the information from LEAs, or are you also going to have those individualized reports for board review or for anyone else who needs it?
Thank you, Chair, if I may respond.
Yes, please.
So thank you, Board Member Lear. So you are correct that our federal reporting requirements are required at the LEA level. So these are not an aggregate report. We are required to report these items that are included in the federal response at each individual LEA. So because of that, and because that is tied to the federal dollars, that is a financial requirement in regards to being able to receive that funding. So we will have it for every single LEA that received these funds. As far as our plans go, in regards to the report to the federal government, that takes place in an online system where we, again, line item report by LEA for each of the expenditures. And we will have the outcomes of this particular survey where we could easily report it at the LEA level as the board requests. I would clarify that our intent for the state report for our Utah legislature is to do it at the aggregate level, just because that is the format that is most easily digestible in regards to recognizing that there are many data points they are considering in making these decisions. However, we will have the underlying data and can certainly provide that at the local level upon request.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Okay. Board Member Hanson. Oh, maybe Board Member Hanson, did you have something additional, or your hand was still?
No, just keeping my hand above my head. I apologize.
Oh, well, we all need a stretch now and again. Okay, Superintendent.
Yeah,
you have a wrap up?
I think we're good to go. We need to launch this tomorrow. So I just want to make sure, Sarah, I think earlier you looked like you had a question or a comment. Did you get everything covered that you needed?
I just have one follow-up question for Board Member Hanson. I put it in the chat, but I'll send an email so that we can get that clarified. I just want to make sure, related to the first question, that I understand the specific numeric value he's seeking in regards to student online days versus in-person days and how we're going to capture that.
And then also, Board Member Hanson, the point of contact question that you mentioned, we have the point of contact information readily available. So I don't think that's something that we need to survey. We have that in other places and we can capture that.
Okay, do you have anything else in your report?
Thank you so much for the additional time. I do appreciate Board Members Lear and Hanson engaging in the conversation to help us think about, since we already have a tool going out, how we can gather information that will be helpful to the board. So look forward to getting those responses back that will meet multiple needs and moving forward from there to see how it might influence policy, funding needs, et cetera. Thank you.
Okay.